Stargazing. Stars, hide your fires. Let not light see my black and deep desires. William Shakespeare, Macbeth. This portion of the video series discusses why none of the photographs from none of the Apollo missions shows any traces of stars in the lunar sky. You may at first think that whether you could see stars or not from the lunar surface would be a non-contentious discussion. Well, I'm afraid that you couldn't be more mistaken. You are about to learn that this is far from being a trivial matter. We have our believers who are quite happy that you don't see any stars in the Apollo visuals and are more than eager to explain why this is to be expected. Our skeptics think that you should be able to see a heavenly firmament full of bright stars, but they say that NASA could not convincingly fake the stars in the sky, so they decided to do away with the stars altogether. Our astronauts? Well, they seem to be totally confused on the issue and unsure whether they saw stars or not. Confused already? Well, you certainly will be. It is not only our skeptics who think you would be able to see stars from the lunar surface, but paradoxically, Apollo believer Phil Plait, webmaster of Bad Astronomy website, also had this idea when he states on his website, "If you were standing on the moon, you would indeed see stars, even during the day." In none of the Apollo photographs or videos taken on any of the Apollo missions are any stars visible. The lack of stars in the Apollo images has been a mainstay of the skeptics' argument since it was first commented on by Bill Kaysing, and they claim that this is totally unreasonable. They suggest that the stars would have been plainly visible, if not totally spectacular, in the deep black sky of space. In this video, we will attempt to understand the pros and cons for this argument. Seeing and recording. Before we start to examine this aspect of the skeptic's complaint, we will need to distinguish between what the astronauts saw and what is shown in the photographs. The human eye operates quite differently from the camera lens. First of all, the camera records the image on some media, film, tape, or nowadays mostly captured digitally, whereas the eye only produces a transient image in the brain. So, what the eye has seen is a matter of memory, like the Apollo 11 astronauts, who, as we will soon see, appear to have some problems remembering what they actually saw in regards to the stars. Another major difference is that the eye provides a stereoscopic image due to the two lenses, one in each eye, so a three-dimensional image. In effect, this means that the eye sees height, width, and depth. The camera only records in two dimensions, just height and width. The eye can also adapt itself to change in light within a few seconds, unlike a camera which uses a pre-designated exposure. The final factor is focus. The eye is part of a sophisticated information processing system linked to the brain and focuses automatically, whereas a camera needs to be focused manually, often using the human eye as a guide. There are now cameras that can provide a certain amount of focusing automatically. This concept of focus is an important point when we come to discuss the Apollo photographs later in this video series. So, when we are discussing what the astronauts say they saw and what the photographs show, we need to bear these factors in mind. Visual sighting of stars. One would at first imagine that leaving the blanketed atmosphere of the Earth, that the stars would be more visible than they are from the surface of the Earth. The first man in space, the Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, repeatedly commented on the brightness of the stars when he was above the atmosphere. He said that the stars were very well seen, and that they were much brighter than can be seen here from Earth. The skeptics therefore question the fact that none of the astronauts from any Apollo mission marveled or even waxed lyrically at the sight of the stars. Even more surprisingly, in the post-flight press conference on television, the Apollo 11 astronauts seemed unsure as to whether they had seen any stars. During this press conference, Neil Armstrong was asked whether or not he remembered seeing any stars from the moon's surface in the lunar sky. His reply?
We were never able to see stars from the lunar surface or on the daylight side of the moon by eye without looking through the optics. I don't recall during the period of time that we were photographing the solar corona what stars we could see.
To which Michael Collins quickly added,
I don't remember seeing any.
At this point, Armstrong glances at Collins as if to remind him not to talk about the stars. Well, that is an assertion made by the skeptics. The paradox in this was that Collins didn't actually land on the moon. He stayed aloft in the command module circling the moon, so his interjection seems somewhat out of context. Is it just me, but when I watched that video on the Apollo 11 press conference, and I have watched it many more times than I care to mention, I am reminded of these three schoolboys up before the headmaster after being caught smoking behind the cycle shed. There is something all too weird about their demeanor. To say that they looked uncomfortable would be a gross understatement, but this for men who had just triumphantly returned from the moon? It would appear that skeptic Steve the Chemist takes a similar view when he equates the moon landing with the triumphal celebrations after a major baseball win against the odds. At least you would imagine a smile following a great accomplishment. After all, these astronauts were now world heroes. For the skeptics, this seeing or not seeing stars appears to be a significant inconsistency, as one would envisage that the stars would be very bright in the deep black lunar sky. It has even been suggested by some skeptics that the astronauts were apparently told to avoid talking about the stars, as the correct astrological positions of the constellations were considered to be too difficult for NASA to simulate in the supposedly faked lunar backgrounds. They point out that an amateur astronomer would have been able to quickly judge any small inconsistencies. However, it is not all that clear whether we should be able to see stars from the moon's surface. I could say, mischievously, that only the astronauts could tell us, but they appear to have suffered a memory loss. It does seem strange that you travel through empty space all the way to the moon and you don't remember what you saw. I need to confess that I have not actually been to the moon, so I am just speculating, but I can only think of three things to grab my attention if I was there: the moonscape, the distant Earth, and the stars. To forget one of these appears to be careless in the extreme and has led some skeptics to suggest that the astronauts were instructed to avoid as much as possible any discussion on this subject. Photographic evidence of stars. As we mentioned at the beginning of this video, visual sightings of stars are not the same as not seeing stars in the photographs taken on the lunar surface, as we are told that the exposures used in the cameras were such as to not overexpose the photographs. The believers argue that the time length for exposures used for taking photographs in the bright sunlight on the moon were insufficient to pick up the very limited light emanated by the stars in comparison to the bright light reflected off the lunar surface. We do know from experience that a clear night on Earth is generally associated with a black sky and the visual presence of stars. In daytime, the light from the sun, and to an extent our atmosphere, overwhelms and drowns out all of the comparatively dimmer light sources in space, so it is highly probable that a similar effect occurs in the daylight on the moon. Photography can be a complex subject with terms such as exposure, aperture, focus, ISO number, burst mode, depth of field, SLR, shutter speed, white balance, and so forth. For most of us with our automatic point-and-shoot digital cameras, now perhaps most commonly we use smartphones, we have little knowledge of the complexities of photography. It is therefore difficult to judge if the exposure rate could account for no stars being visible on photographs taken on the moon. Perhaps all that we can surmise is that this appears to be a plausible explanation. We are offered no evidence or proof by the skeptics that the stars should definitely be visible. Nevertheless, our skeptics do ask why, when the astronauts had the ability to change the exposure setting, they didn't do this and give us the stunning view of the universe that we all eagerly expected. The believers point out that the astronauts all landed on the day side of the moon and that all videos that they shot from orbit were over the day side, so the exposure settings were all set for daylight. They suggest an experiment. If you are conversant with photography, that you set your camera to the shutter speed of 1/125th of a second at f8, a setting typical of the slower film's use in 1969, then aim it at the night sky and shoot pictures and see how many stars you can see. Even with the naked eye, you may have difficulty seeing stars from the daytime lunar surface unless you stood in a shadow and shielded yourself from any light reflected from the ground. We have all heard about light pollution in astronomy, in which ambient light reduces the visibility of stars. A similar effect occurs when trying to view stars from a brightly lit area at night. Believers' view of the stars. The fact that no stars are visible on any of the Apollo photographs or videos is not a problem for the believers. We will let Amy Title of Vintage Space explain why. Amy explains that it is all a question of exposure they had to use because of the brightness of the lunar surface. This is illustrated by Graham Stickings as he tells us about the camera exposure. But according to believer YTMOOG, there were over 200 photographs of the stars from the Apollo 16 mission. Admittedly, these photographs were taken from the Lunar Observatory in the ultraviolet spectrum, which is not visible to the naked eye, so they do not really contribute to our discussion of astronauts seeing stars, but at least they may prove that we went to the moon. Astronauts' view of the stars. You would think that if anyone knew the answer to whether it is possible to see stars on the moon with the naked eye, then it would be the astronauts themselves. Unfortunately, the skeptics would have you believe that the astronauts appear to be suffering from some mild amnesia. At the Apollo 11 press conference, Patrick Moore, a UK astronomer and ardent Apollo believer, we met him before in the foreword of this video with his views on the skeptics, posed this question to the astronaut Neil Armstrong.
When you looked up at the sky, could you actually see the stars and the solar corona in spite of the glare?
To which Neil Armstrong replied,
We were never able to see stars from the lunar surface or on the daylight side of the moon by eye without looking through the optics. I don't recall during the period of time that we were photographing the solar corona what stars we could see.
As we mentioned above, Michael Collins then surprisingly interjects,
I don't remember seeing any.
Now this interjection surprised our skeptics and I think also Neil Armstrong. The point is that Collins was never on the surface of the moon. Remember, he was the command module pilot and spent his time high above the moon performing hourly orbits. So for him to comment on seeing stars from the moon is paradoxical, as one must assume that where he was, he saw nothing but stars. Also of note is that in Michael Collins' book, Carrying the Fire, 1974, he recounts his experience while on the Gemini 10 mission in 1966 with astronaut John Young. In this, he describes his spacewalk. My God, the stars are everywhere above me and on all sides, even below me somewhat. Down there, next to the obscure horizon, the stars are bright and they are steady. Of course, I know that the solar twinkle is created by the atmosphere, and I have seen twinkle-less stars before in a planetarium, but this is different. This is no simulation. This is the best view of the immense universe that a human ever had. Neil Armstrong was interviewed again by the ubiquitous Patrick Moore in 1970 for the BBC Sky at Night program. When asked what the sky looks like from the moon, Neil Armstrong replied,
The sky is a deep black when viewed from the moon, as it is when viewed from cislunar space, the space between the Earth and the moon. The Earth is the only visible object other than the sun that can be seen, although there have been some reports of seeing planets.
The important phrase to note that Armstrong says that the sky is a deep black from cislunar space, but again, no mention of the billions of stars that must have been visible. We do know that the astronauts could see the stars as they carried star maps and a sextant. They used star sightings to check their navigation, so his statement is somewhat intriguing. Also, Apollo 17 astronaut Gene Cernan claimed he did see stars from the lunar surface, as he states, It was also generally true that when you were on the lunar surface in the LEM shadow, there were too many bright things in your field of view for the stars to be visible. But if you allowed yourself to just focus and maybe even just shielded your eyes to some degree, even outside the LM shadow, you could see stars in the sky. I could see stars through my helmet visor, not easily, but it can be done. We could always listen to the astronauts themselves, see what they have to say, as this video by Alan Weisbecker explains. Unfortunately, I think that it must depend on which astronaut you talk to and probably which day of the week. So there you have it. According to the astronauts, you can, and then again you cannot, see stars from the lunar surface. Any wiser? Blowing in the wind. Blow, blow, thou winter wind, thou art not so unkind as man's ingratitude. William Shakespeare, As You Like It. In all 6 Apollo lunar landing missions, the ceremonial planting of the American flag close to the lunar lander was one of the first activities for the astronauts on the lunar surface. Now hopefully, as you should already know by now, the moon has no atmosphere, no air, basically just a vacuum. On Earth, when you raise a flag, you expect to see it flutter in the wind. After all, that is the purpose of the flag. It flutters because it is disturbed by the wind, which is a change in air pressure. On the moon, this would be impossible as the flag would just hang loose. So, NASA created a special flagpole with a horizontal stiffening rod at right angles to the pole to prevent it collapsing, like an inverted L shape. The flag and the pole weighed 9 pounds 7 ounces and the flag measured 60 by 36 inches. Interestingly, the flags used were standard U.S. government issue costing $5.50 at the time, and the extra tubing to keep it stiff at an additional cost of 75 cents. Not too heavy on the NASA budget, but then again, they did use 7, 1 for each Apollo mission. So, all well and good, the flag wouldn't flutter on the moon, but would be clearly visible because of the L-shaped tubing arrangement, and who doesn't want to see the American flag? Here in the ceremony from Apollo 17, as you may observe, there is some fluttering of the flag as the astronauts erect it. The flag waves! Unfortunately, in all of the Apollo flag planting videos, the flag does appear to wave as the astronauts erect the flag. Examples from Apollo 14 and 15 show this clearly. You guessed it, another anomaly for the skeptics. They point out that the flags can only wave when they are in an atmosphere and air to make it move. So they claim, without a doubt, that the video must have been made on some film set on Earth and that the breeze is possibly from air conditioning units to keep the set cool. After all, if it was fake, then one assumes that they must have some gigantic hot spotlight on the film set to represent the sun. This anomaly was first mooted by Bill Kaysing. The believers point out that the flag does not move unless the astronauts are touching it. There may well be a simple reason for this, as Amy Title explains on Vintage Space. The first operation for the astronauts in planting the flag was to hammer a pole 18 inches into the ground, then the upper part of the flag assembly is twisted into the lower pole. It is this twisting motion by the astronaut that causes the flag to move, giving the appearance that it is blowing in a breeze. When you flap a flag in a vacuum, there is no air to reduce vibrations, so it will take some time for the flag to settle down. The flag was carried on the outside of the lunar lander in a stainless steel tube with inner insulation to protect it from the likely 2000 C heat from the descent engine. NASA state that when the flag was unrolled, it still maintained some creasing which only added to the illusion of waving. This is all explained in the so-called Apollo Fact Files, which despite the title, not officially from NASA. The evidence. The Mythbusters TV series produced a video to explain how the Apollo flags could appear to be waving on the airless moon by placing a replica flag in a vacuum chamber to see how it moved when touched. They conclude that the flag blowing in the breeze anomaly is not the case and that they confidently believe that they have managed to mimic the equivalent of the Apollo videos in a vacuum here on Earth, so in their opinion, disproving the Apollo hoax idea. One of our skeptics, Hunchback, has responded to the analysis of the Mythbusters video, which casts doubt on the validity of the experiment and that the real situation on the moon was not reproduced in the vacuum chamber. In particular, the experiment neglects the significantly different gravities between the Earth and the moon, which means that the flag would beat slower in the 1/6 gravity of the moon. Also, they did not firmly fix the flagpole, so in the experiments, the flagpole twisted in tune with the waving flag, producing more impetus for the movement. The Mythbusters state that the beating of the flag would slow down quicker on the moon, which they demonstrate by letting air rush into the vacuum chamber. The inward rushing air will obviously have an effect on the flag movement. So the conclusion must be that the Mythbusters did not prove anything beyond a reasonable doubt. In fact, as we shall see later, we may have inadvertently proved something else. The believers are at pains to point out that if you look at the Apollo videos, the flag only moves when touched by an astronaut. The Mythbusters challenged anyone to find proof that the flag moved when not touched. Seems that was not too difficult, as there is one video clip from Apollo 15 that clearly shows the flag moving when astronaut Dave Scott walks past it, but he appears to have been too far away to have had any contact with it. There is yet another from Apollo 14, which we will discuss later. The editor of the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal, Eric Jones, who naturally staunchly defends NASA, has suggested 6 possible explanations why the flag moved even though nobody appears to have touched it. 1. Astronaut Dave Scott could have brushed against the flag with his left arm as he went by. 2. He could have kicked some dirt with his boot that hit the bottom of the flag. 3. He could have pushed a mound of soil sideways with his boot that pushed against the flagstaff. 4. The impact of his boots on the ground as he ran past could have shaken the flagstaff. 5. He might have been carrying a static charge which attracted the flag material. And 6. The flag could have been disturbed by emissions from the backpack. All of these possible explanations have been analyzed by Gerard White in a 3-part series in which he attempts to demonstrate that they are all extremely unlikely. So the conclusion he makes is that the flag moved because of the air pressure of the astronaut moved past, which he concludes proves that the video was shot in Earth's atmosphere. The question we are trying to answer here is the flag waving on the moon or somewhere else, such as a film set on Earth? In this context, there is an interesting 2-part video by Steve the Chemist who examines the waving of the flag from a physics viewpoint. The waving flag is essentially a crude pendulum, and its period of swing can therefore be analyzed. He critically examines the video by timing the swinging interval of the flag and shows that it closely matches the motion of the Apollo Moon video with a period of about 2 seconds. However, on the moon, the flag should swing much slower due to the less gravitational force, in fact, with a period of about 7.5 seconds. This is an order of magnitude different, and from this analysis, he concludes that the Apollo Moon video could not have been filmed on the moon, but must have been filmed here on a set on Earth. Compelling stuff. Just as I was completing this video, I received an email from the skeptic Marcus Allen, who directed my attention to a new posting on YouTube. The video was a clip from the Johnson Space Center and obtained by Jet Windsor, author of the YouTube video Moon Hoax Now from the Spacecraft Films DVD Apollo 14 to Frau Moreau. This video shows the scene on the Apollo 14 mission after the second EVA and the astronauts have returned to the lunar lander. It shows clearly that the American flag waves 8 times. The believers' often repeated assertion that the flag only moves when the astronaut is touching it has again been shown to be false, I would imagine much to the skeptics' delight. I feel sure that this video will receive some considerable attention from our believers. After all, you don't see anyone touch the flag in this video. One has to think what could have caused the flag to suddenly move. It has been suggested by NASA that the flag moves as a response to the lunar lander cabin being decompressed. The skeptics will say that this seems highly improbable, even if miraculously the gases escaping from the lunar lander did blow the flag to point away. What force caused the flag to blow back, and this 8 times over a period of 3 minutes? According to Jet Windsor, the only dynamic on the moon is the heat from the sun, but how could this possibly influence the flag and cause it to move? There were no major solar flares during any of the Apollo missions, so that cause can also be discounted. However, our believer, Luke S., thinks he may have a definite answer to this 8 flag waving anomaly. He refers to the Apollo 14 science report and the cold cathode gauge experiment. The cold cathode gauge measures the gas concentration of particles in the moon's atmosphere. Now, as we have repeatedly mentioned, the moon has virtually no atmosphere, so the cold cathode gauge is extremely sensitive to even the thinnest atmosphere. Luke S. examines the results of the readings obtained when the astronauts depressurized the lunar lander and shows that this registers on the cold cathode instrument. They were opening the cabin depressurization valve, and as the pressure was dropping, astronaut Shepard noticed that his spacesuit was losing pressure, so they closed the valve to try to fix the problem. They then opened the valve to try again, but had the same problem, so they closed the valve again. In total, it took 3 times until they finally succeeded. According to Luke S., this accounts for the first 6 flag movements, and the 7th and 8th movement, he claims, are related to the lunar lander door finally being opened. I am not clear why this should cause another escape of air if the cabin had already been depressurized, but there may have been some residual air remaining which was released as the cabin door was opened. His contention is that the escaping gases would be sufficient to disturb the flag. I cannot explain why the flag moves twice for each gas escape event unless it is the resistance of the pole, but the coincidence of the 4 releases of air from the lunar lander would appear to be significant. At mission elapsed time 1:36-1909, Shepard says, "Houston, Antares, we are depressing the cabin for jettison now." So adding the GMT 3 minutes to the release time of 1:36-1909 gives 1:36-2209 for the air valve release, which corresponds to the chart showing the event at 13:22 GMT. A few seconds after this, the first flag move is seen. This may be conclusive proof that the flag was affected by the cabin release pressure surge. The sound of silence. The saying is true. The empty vessel makes the greatest sound. William Shakespeare, Henry V. No sound in a vacuum. There is virtually no atmosphere on the moon. In effect, it is to all intents and purposes a vacuum. No doubt we will all remember that demonstration at school in the physics lecture of the bell in the glass jar. The bell is ringing loudly and can be heard through the glass jar, but as the air is pumped out of the jar, the sound diminishes until finally, as the vacuum is reached, the sound stops. This experiment was to show that sound travels in compressive air waves and that with no air, as in the vacuum, there is no sound. In case you missed this demonstration at school, then take a look at this video above. I did wonder at the time how useful this knowledge would be to me. I mean, how often was I likely to be trapped in a vacuum calling for help? Now with my new acquired knowledge, I am at the forefront of science, able to understand this whole sound in a vacuum business. You may be wondering why we are talking about sound. Well, our skeptics are complaining that they don't hear any sound when they think they should, and that they hear sound when they think they shouldn't. There is clearly no pleasing some people. Not enough sound. First of all, no sound when the skeptics expect to hear it. What does this mean? This occurs when the astronauts are in their spacecraft with the noise of the rocket engines blasting away, but they are still able to talk crystal clearly, and there is no audible sound from the engine.
99, proceeded, 3, 2, 1, ignition. Right away, Houston.
The best example given of this by the skeptics is the descent of the lunar lander towards the moon's surface.
Okay, watch the throttle now, here it comes. Down, 27. Computer likes it. Beautiful. Roger.
The skeptics are at pains to let you know that the 2 astronauts are virtually sitting on top of a 10,500-pound forced thrust descent engine, which even working at 3,000-pound forced thrust must be extremely noisy, but we do not hear any sound from the rocket. There would be no sound emanating from the outside of the lunar lander in the vacuum of the moon, but inside the capsule's atmosphere, one would imagine it would be very noisy. The believers have the simple answer: the astronauts are wearing their spacesuits, so the sound of the rocket engine is not heard because the astronaut's microphone is well shielded from the outside sound. The only thing you hear, in addition to the astronauts and mission control, is a slight amount of static. I am afraid the skeptics say that it is not possible that they are wearing spacesuits. In order to handle the computer controls which guide the descent, then the astronauts need to push buttons on a small computer keypad. The keys on the Apollo computer keypad are about 3 times the size of those on the standard desktop computer keyboard. You may well recall my suggestion to try to type your next email wearing gardening gloves. The skeptics ask, how when your life depends on it are you really chancing on hitting the wrong buttons and bringing your holiday to a sudden end? The skeptics are certain that the astronauts were not wearing their spacesuits. They also say that whenever they see astronauts inside the lunar lander, they are not wearing their spacesuits. So the debate seems to hinge on whether the astronauts are wearing their spacesuits or not. The skeptics say no, but the believers say yes. The Apollo flight plan did call for the astronauts to be suited up in their spacesuits for the lunar module landing, so if they did follow the flight plan, then they were wearing their spacesuits. This was a standard procedure as a safety precaution in case the lunar module's outer skin was damaged in the landing. This is also stated in the video at time 9:38. To date, I have been able to find any definite video evidence that shows that they were wearing their spacesuits. The Discovery Channel program, When We Left Earth Landing the Eagle, does show at times 37 and again at times 38-28 that the astronauts appear to be wearing their spacesuits. I have no idea if these clips are true NASA video. If you are interested to know how the landing was achieved, there is a demonstration in the miniseries From the Earth to the Moon by Home Box Office TV. The skeptics also say that there is a very similar situation with the takeoffs from the moon. In this case, the astronauts stood immediately by the side of a 3,000-pound force-thrust descent engine, but in the transmissions immediately on the liftoff, there is no sound of the rocket, and the astronauts can be clearly heard. The skeptics also say that there is a very similar situation with the takeoff from the moon. In this case, the astronauts stood immediately by the side of the 3,000-pound force-thrust descent engine, but in the transmission immediately on liftoff, there is no sound of the rocket and the astronauts can be heard clearly. I need to add here that it must also have been quite hot standing by the rocket as it burned at 2000 C, but nobody seems to mention the excessive heat, so perhaps I am wrong. We have the same debate, were they wearing their spacesuits or not? The Apollo flight plan did call for them to be wearing their spacesuits, then they did don on their spacesuits. I expect that you may be inclined to go with the believers on this one. If the astronauts followed the flight plan, and we have no evidence to suggest that they didn't, then they were wearing their spacesuits, and consequently, the rocket engine noise would probably not be heard in the voice transmissions.